Good morning, everyone. I'm having voice issues, so I apologize about that in advance. We're going to start a new study this morning, and as you know, as part of the adult education, we have rotating classes, and I have taught this class in the fellowship hall earlier in the year, and now it's time for this rotation to move into the adult area here in the auditorium. And so this will actually be 9 weeks. Typically the rotations are, thank you, Jack. The rotations are 8 weeks, but next Sunday morning we'll be having a guest speaker for worship service, but also during the class time. And so we're going to expand this rotation by 1 week. And so we're going to be studying from the book of Hebrews, one of my favorite studies. And I've had the opportunity to teach this some recently, and I enjoy getting the opportunity to teach this lesson, or this series of lessons. Since it is 8 weeks, we go hyperspeed. I will tell you that because we have 13 chapters to cover. But it is I hope you enjoy this study as much as I enjoy getting to prepare for it and present some thoughts from this book of Hebrews. What draws you to Jesus? What draws you to Jesus? I'm not going to ask you to answer out loud. I just want you to think about that in your mind. What draws you to Jesus? Now, as you've thought about that, now I want to flip the coin over and ask you, what pushes you away from Him? What distracts you from Him? And that answer is probably different for all of us. But if we're honest, I think there are times when we are drawn and there are times when we are pushed away by a lot of different circumstances. This particular study focuses on a writing made to a group that were struggling with having been formerly drawn to Him and now being pushed away from Him. And so that's what we're going to talk about for the next 8 weeks. We're going to talk about how that Jesus is the reason we should be drawing near to God, not being pushed away from Him. So we're going to start by, as we typically do in a new study, is to look at some introductory thoughts about this particular writing. How many of you in the last 2 years have done an in-depth study of Hebrews? A couple of us, all right. Well, that's good. Maybe this will be a good reminder. Maybe you'll learn something. Maybe you can share something and help me learn as well from this incredibly deep, rich writing. The purpose, if we were going to give it a purpose, is to encourage and warn first century Christians, specifically Hebrew Christians, who have endured persecution, to not give up, or those that are tempted to waver from their faith. The title of the book is To the Hebrews. We don't know specifically what group the writer was writing to because it doesn't necessarily tell us. Some would argue that this is a letter. It doesn't meet all of the typical structures of a letter. It ends like a letter, but it doesn't start the way we typically see letters saying, who the writer is and to whom I'm writing. So many would argue and say that this is more of a sermon that morphs into a letter at the very end. But the purpose, again, is that you have Hebrew Jewish Christians who are likely in the second generation, who now have undergone some persecution and are now being tempted to turn away from Christ and back into Judaism. And you might say, well, now why would they do that? Well, think about it for a second. As a Jew, you've been a Jew all your life. And as a child, you were taught that you are God's child. You are under the covenant with God because you are a Jew. And that's all you have ever known. And your relationship with Yahweh is based upon the fact that you are a Jew, that you're born into that relationship. But now you've learned and you've been taught that that relationship is not based upon lineage any longer. It's based upon faith in God's Son, and you were committed to Him, and you obeyed Him, and you were baptized into Jesus Christ, and you began to worship and to praise Him and to honor Him and to live for Him. But then you have people that you know, your family even, who are saying, wait a second, you're giving up on God. Accepting this Jesus is giving up on God. You are a Jew. You are a chosen nation. So you have your own family pushing against you. You have government officials pushing against you. You have persecution going on. And you're starting to be tempted. You were first drawn near, but now you're being tempted to be pushed away. And the writer is saying, Hebrew, Jewish Christians, don't ever give up on Jesus. You're going to hear me say that in the next 9 weeks many, many, many times. Because that's it in a nutshell. Don't ever give up on Jesus. Now again, we don't know exactly to whom this writing is made, other than it's Hebrew Christians. We don't know where they were or whether it was written generally. There's arguments for all different thoughts. Bottom line, it really doesn't matter. But what does matter is that we have to keep in mind to whom this particular writing was made. Because as we read through it and go through it, you're going to see some very striking things. Specifically, what you're going to see over and over and over again is references to the Old Covenant, to the Old Law, to the Old Scriptures. So that tells me that this was written to people who knew the Old Law, who knew the Old Testament. Because the writer is going to use Old Testament law, Old Testament Scriptures to support his position that you should not give up on Jesus. He's using Jewish custom, Jewish law, Jewish thought to support that Jesus is the answer. And so that's why we know, in addition to it being titled to the Hebrews, the fact that it's written filled with proof text of Old Testament, that it was written for people who would understand Old Testament. Okay? We don't know who wrote it. Lots of, if you got commentaries and you stacked them to the ceiling, you would get lots of different ideas. Okay? And I'll just mention a couple. I mean, the most popular is that it was Paul. Okay? But it doesn't necessarily fit the way that Paul typically wrote. Okay? There are others who said, well, this very well could have been written by Barnabas. Okay. Others say it might have been written by Apollos. Apollos was a very eloquent speaker, very, very intelligent man. Some say it could have been written by Apollos. Others thought maybe Luke wrote it because of the Greek syntax and structure. I don't know. Really, it doesn't make any difference. Okay? Bottom line is that the author knew Timothy, knew the people he was writing to, because at the end of this writing he's going to reference specifically about Timothy. We know that likely it's someone who was second generation because of the way he says us when he includes himself in many of the writings. But again, it doesn't matter. Okay? Other than this person obviously knew Old Testament, was familiar with the people he was writing to, that was powerful in inspiration and powerful in thought. Okay? Since we don't know who wrote it, we really don't know when it was written either. Okay? One of the most important dates we do know is that Clement of Rome quoted from this writing in roughly 95 or 96 AD. So it was sometime before that. Okay? The other factor that plays into the date is where, in reference to AD 70, was it written. Now, you probably know, but if you don't know, the significance of the date AD 70 was the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? When the system of Jewish worship was done away with. Okay? Because as you read through Hebrews, and I challenge you, please read through as we go along, you're going to see many, many references to the priesthood. And the way in which it's written, it tends to give you thought, the idea that it was written while that priesthood was still going on. So that would say that it was pre-AD 70. But I still don't know. Because in AD 70, again, temple was destroyed, the practice was destroyed. But most people tend to argue that it was pre-AD 70. Okay? Pre-destruction of Jerusalem. I've given reference to this already. It's written in Greek, Greek structure, Greek syntax. So written obviously by someone who was familiar and comfortable in writing in Greek. Okay? So we don't know when, we don't know who. We know it was written to, but not specifically to whom it was written. But the fourth thing I want to focus on just for a few moments, and this is very, very important, and I've alluded to that already as well, is there's some hints that we need to keep in mind as we study this writing. Okay? And the main one is this. We need to walk in the reader's sandals. Okay? As we're studying, as we're reading this, we need to, the best we can, is to put ourselves in the sandals of the person in the first century that was reading it. To put ourselves in the sandals of a first century second generation Christian Jew or Jewish Christian. I know that's a challenge, okay? Especially if you haven't done a whole lot of study on the Jewish system. When we get over in a few chapters and start talking about the sacrifices, and we're talking about the Day of Atonement and things like that, we start talking about Melchizedek. Don't freak out. Don't worry. I'm gonna help you through it. Okay. But our goal is the best we can is to try to put ourselves in those sandals so that we can understand what the writer's trying to communicate, and also what the proof text that the writer uses to prove his point or points. Okay. So when we talk about hints for studying, the primary hint is, as you're reading this, try not to read it from 2024 perspective, because it's not going to make as much sense. If you read it from the first century perspective, from the Jewish first century perspective, from the Jewish Christian first century perspective, a whole lot more is there. Okay? And again, I'm going to try to help us with that as we go along. So, we don't know the time necessarily. We don't know who wrote necessarily. We do know some about the structure. We don't know exactly to whom it was written other than Jewish Christians. But let's try to keep it in mind that that's the people that he's focusing on, that have endured some persecution, that are being tempted to say, wait a second, am I really, really convinced that this Jesus guy is who he claimed to be? Or is it just easier to go back to doing something that's comfortable, that I've done all my life, that everybody for centuries did? That's the appeal. And that's what the writer's trying to warn against. Okay? All right. The other concept that you're going to read, and it's going to be used specifically in Hebrews 8 and again in Hebrews 10, is this idea of shadows. Okay? Shadows. He's going to reference that the law was a shadow, that the temple was a shadow, that the veil was a shadow, that the furniture within the temple are shadows. They were pointing towards something else. All right, don't get hung up, okay? I just let you be thinking about that and chewing on it, because we're going to get there. Because again, he's talking to Hebrews, first century, who all they had ever known was a priest, and their relationship to God was only through the priest and what the priest did in the temple. Okay? And he's saying these are only shadows. So just be mindful of that. We're going to talk about shadows. Okay. As we go through the next few weeks, here's what I hope that we communicate, that we walk away together grasping these concepts. That Jesus is superior, bottom line. He is superior to anything in Old Testament law, Old Testament history, Old Testament covenant, Old Testament relationship. Christ is superior. And he's going to start off this writing by talking about the fact that Christ is deity. He is God. That Christ not only was God, but that Christ was man, chapter 2. And that because of his supremacy, He is far more superior to prophets, to angels, to Moses, to Abraham. I didn't put Abraham on my list, but I should have. Abraham, Joshua, the entire Old Testament priesthood. And because of that, we, Christians, have a better covenant, a better relationship, and a better rest. All right? So, that's our roadmap. That's where we're heading as we read this and study this writing. Now, I may fall into an old trap and call it a letter, the letter to the Hebrews. Again, it probably isn't a letter, okay? So I apologize in advance if I say letter. I'll probably correct myself. But it's a writing. It's an incredibly powerful writing. The other thing I want to talk about generally as far as introduction is that as we make our way through the supremacy of Jesus, there's going to be at least 5 warnings or admonitions. There's more than that. I mean, there's probably more like 7 or 8 or 9. But there's generally 5 that most commentators focus on. And we'll talk about each one of those in turn. One, a warning that we should pay closer attention. In chapter 3, that we should remain faithful. In chapter 5, that we should grow, that we should mature. Chapter 10, that we should draw near. And then finally in chapter 12, that we should not miss out on God's grace. Okay? Hope you see this common thread winding through that Jesus is superior. And because of those, we need to pay closer attention. We need to remain faithful to Him. We need to grow and mature in Him. We need to draw near to Him. And then we don't need to miss the grace which is through and because of Him. Okay? Now, that was a really, really fast introduction. But I want to get right into it. Okay? Into chapter 1. Any questions about the introduction? Good, because I probably don't know the answer. All right, good. All right, chapter 1. He's going to start this writing, and it's really going to be really clear where we're heading. He starts it this way. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by Son, whom He appointed the heir of all things, through whom also He created the world. Why would the author begin his writing this way? Here's why. He's going to start off by establishing a very important comparison, and he's going to prepare his readers for the very, very first warning in chapter 2. Okay? Okay, so let me back up. If my purpose is to focus my readers on Jesus, and that I ought to listen to Jesus and draw near to Jesus, I'm going to start off by saying why and who Jesus is. Okay? And he's going to start off with this comparison. He's going to start off by saying, in times past, God spoke to His people, to our fathers, that's the way the writer says, the patriarchs. He communicated to our fathers, to the Jews. Remember, wear their sandals, okay? Put them on. In a certain way. And that was through messengers. Prophets. That's what the word means. It means a spokesperson. Okay? God, long ago, in many different ways, spoke to us through prophets, through messengers. And then he does a transition, a comparison. But in these last days, where we're living now, the form by which God communicated to His people has changed. It's no longer through prophets. It's not through angels. It's not through Moses. It's not through Abraham. It's not through any other person or being other than Son. Now, the English Standard Version uses the word, in its translation, puts the word His there. In the original Greek, there is no article, not the Son or a Son. It's just in the original Greek, it would read, has spoken to us by Son. Now, to a Jew, the Son has significant meaning. Begotten. He's going to later use the word begotten. Chosen. Firstborn. And to a Jew, the firstborn was the important relationship between father and the rest of the family. Through the firstborn. And he's saying that the messenger for us now is the Son. Nobody else. Has spoken to us by Son, whom He did what? He appointed. And He appointed Him as what? Heir. Incredibly important here. The heir is the person who continues that line, that relationship, right? The person who has the authority and the right and the ability to be the spokesperson for the Father. Not a prophet, not an angel, not Old Testament, Son, who has been appointed heir of a whole lot of stuff. All things. And interestingly enough, He doesn't stop there. Appointed heir of all things, through whom also He did what? Created the world. All right, he's going to start off this writing by saying the person that you need to focus on is Son. And he's going to use 7 descriptors in the beginning to talk about who Son is. Let's look at them. First, we've already mentioned, He is the heir of all things. He is the recipient from God of all things. Secondly, He's creator. Now, you can take creator and right next to it you can put a slash and you can put God. John 1 talks about that, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It talks about how that Jesus was involved in the creation. The writer here wants readers wearing your sandals to understand that the person you need to focus on and not give up on is deity. That He is the person that God has chosen to be the messenger. And if God chooses the messenger, you need to pay attention not only to the message, but the messenger. Right? That's how he's starting this entire writing. To focus on the comparison of how things used to be to how things are. Because for thousands of years, I can just hear the writer as he's thinking this out. I understand what they're thinking. For thousands of years, it's been a relationship to God through being a Jew. Through that covenant relationship. And now people are they're tempted to give up on that. I need to inform them, so they understand that it's the Son that's important. He is the messenger. So He's the heir, He's the creator. What He also goes on and says, He is the radiance of God's glory. The radiance, the brightness. Remember the Old Testament story when Moses would go into the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and he would have to put a veil on because his face shone? Jesus is the radiance of God. Now there's one New Testament account which we learn more about that. Remember that? Remember the Mount of Transfiguration? Peter, James, and John go along with Jesus up on the mount, and He is transfigured in front of them. And the Bible says the light was so bright it blinded them. The writer's saying He's God. This messenger is me. The radiance of God's glory. Not only is that, and I think this is cool, the way the writer uses this. He says He is the exact imprint of God's nature. Jesus said, if you've seen me, you have what? You've seen the Father. That's what the writer's saying right here. This person I want you to focus on and don't give up on, He's God. And He is the exact imprint, stamp of God's nature. How God is, Jesus is. How Jesus is, God is. That's the messenger. Not only is He the heir and the creator and the radiance and the exact imprint, but He's also the sustainer of all things. He says there in verse 3, He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of His nature, and He upholds the universe by the power of His word, or the word of His power. He sustains, He upholds the universe by the power of His word. I probably need to pay attention to that word. If that word sustains the universe, if that messenger has the power to sustain the universe by his word, I need to listen to that word. That's what the writer's saying. He then says, not only all of these other things, but this messenger, this Son, is the purification of our sins. He's going to spend a lot of time a little bit later on in this writing talking about purification. He's going to talk about cleansing of the conscience, which the old law couldn't do. But he wants to start off in his introductory thoughts saying, this Son, this messenger, heir, creator, radiance, imprint, sustainer, purifier. And then finally, He is the exalted mediator. Notice what he says there in the latter part of verse 3. Upholds the universe by the power of His word, a word of His power. After making purification for sins, He sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name He has inherited is more excellent than theirs. When he uses and we've talked about this before, but it bears repeating. When the Bible talks about someone setting down, what is that saying? He's done. Architecture, art. If they show the king, typically the king is on the horse in battle. Okay? But when the job is done, the king gets down off the horse and he sits down on the throne to rule. Okay? He's finished. That's what the writer is saying. That this Son, who has all these qualities, has done everything He was intended to do and is sitting by the right hand of God, mediating for us. Later we're going to talk about the fact that He has made our access to God open and that we can approach Him with boldness. That's who we're talking about. That's who the writer wants you, as you read this, to focus on. I mentioned, as we go through this study, you're going to see many proof texts. Chapter 1 is filled with 7 proof texts. He's talked about 7 characteristics of Jesus. Now he's going to use 7 different proof texts to establish that, talking about His supremacy. And you noticed what I just read, he transitions into this idea that He is superior to angels. Does that strike you as a little weird? Why would he start talking about, he's talking about Jesus and he starts talking about angels? Why do you think he thought it necessary to, right at the beginning, after talking about messenger being son and all the characteristics and qualities of the messenger being son, to now saying he's more superior to angels? All right, in case you didn't hear that, and that's a perfect ending of our class this morning, Dan said, messengers, or angels, were messengers. They were prophets. And many believed that the word of an angel was God's word, and it was. So not only is he more superior to any other messenger or prophet, he's superior to a created angelic being, even greater than a human. We're going to stop there. We'll pick up 2 weeks with our study. In the meantime, I challenge you to read through this book, okay? See you next time.